evening. This is Mae Brussell in Carmel, California. This is tape number 368. It's part 4 in the series on Guyana. It's December 22nd, and this is side 1. There were several items in the news this week that may have skipped your attention, and I'd want to dwell on those particular articles with you because we don't want to lose sight of them. The first one was Friday, December the 8th, 1978. The lead article, Memo Discusses Smuggling Witness into Guyana. This is written by Nicholas Hurrock of the New York Times, and it has to do with a correspondence of Terry Buford, the woman closest to Jim Jones, who made the deposit of their money into banks in Zurich and Panama, England, France, and there's supposed to be 12 different bank accounts going into many, many millions, and this is the woman that is staying at Mark Lane's home right now. And it seems that she was discussing with Jim Jones through correspondence early in the year, moving Miss Walden, that's Miss Grace Stevens, from Memphis to Guyana in the custody of Jim Jones. I want to go into that and the implications of this with you. Also, there's another article that is interrelated. It's not separate, and it was in the various newspapers, but covered in 3 different ways, and I want to discuss that with you. And the lead article is Tennessee Parole Probe Not Over, because we're talking again about Tennessee. Grace Walden is in Tennessee. James Earl is in Tennessee. And I want to go right into the story. First, of this investigation of the governor. He'll be out in January, Governor Ray Blanton. And then on to Grace Stevens, and then some more about Mark Lane. You now have my outline that was enclosed with the tape last week of the categories that I do my research under for the Guyana story. And the way I add new stories as they come are to put new numbers, as I explained before, under the various sections. And under Section 6, Conspiratorial Links, I now make a section called 67A, Martin Luther King Assassination, and 67B, Angola Mercenaries, because we'll go into that. And then under cities and countries, I forgot to put Panama and also Angola. Those are important countries, and I'll explain why later, but I want to tell you how I do add, when I get new information, I add to these basic files, and they just keep growing. In 1977, when the House Select Committee started doing their work into the assassination of John Kennedy and Reverend Martin Luther King, there were a rash of deaths of very important witnesses that took place one after the other. In April, there was George de Mohrenschildt and Charles Nicoletti, Carlos Prios Sequeiros. I talked about those on my tape April 11th, 1977. That was Dialogue Conspiracy number 264. And just as I mentioned last week, I had talked about the School for Assassins down in Guyana, August 15th, 77. I also talked about the escape, the second escape of James Earl Ray. The first one was in St. Louis, Missouri, the first round before Martin Luther King was killed. But tape number 274, those of you who have it can play it over, and those of you who don't have it, I'll give a little more update and background on it. It was June the 20th, 1977, and I went into great length about the fact that James Earl Ray was to be the primary witness before the House Select Committee. Probably the 2 most important witnesses who could go before the committee in Washington, D.C. would be Grace Stevens and James Earl Ray. And I mentioned at the time that that escape that James Earl Ray did was a phony escape. It served a lot of purposes, and I think that he would have been allowed to leave, except that the House Committee was just under formation. They were just beginning to start, and they got outraged at the fact that James Earl Ray had escaped, particularly the Black Caucus. So that there's an article in the Washington Post, George Lardner said, Hill Assassination Unit to probe Ray's escape. And I said at the time that the only reason they brought him back was that there was too much pressure on the governor in Tennessee, that they intended to let him leave, but there was too much pressure. And the witnesses, as I say, in the John Kennedy assassination, Gary Powers, William Sullivan, George de Mohrenschildt, the major witnesses were dying off like flies, and at that same time they were planning the escape. and hoping they could get away with it, of James Earl Ray. And then I'll show you through the New York Times article that they were also planning to get rid of Grace Stevens. As it turned out, they didn't use her before the House Select Committee, and they didn't even use James Earl Ray. He was told that he would come back and testify about where he had been and his expenses, and the House Select Committee took $6 million for their investigation and didn't call James Earl Ray or Grace Stevens, but there was a plan afoot to get rid of both of them, just as there was to get rid of these other major witnesses. I also did a tape, before I go on to these news articles, number 294, that was November the 6th, 1977, on Robert Watson. He was a witness to a conversation about killing Martin Luther King that involved members of the John Birch Society and gun running and narcotics traffic and assassination teams. And this also, this Georgia connection is very important to the Martin Luther King assassination and may have very important links down to the Guyana story, because Watson worked closely with Dick Gregory and Mark Lane, and Mark didn't use any of his material before the House Select Committee. The entire hearings, Robert Watson was in a federal prison on a narcotics rap, he said, was planted on him, and I got a Christmas card from him. He's out. But he had a lot of information that he was promised would be used by the House Select Committee, and they came to see him in the federal prisons and took affidavits from him and information on the conspiracy to kill Martin Luther King, and didn't use that information, and now he's out, and I'm sure that they'll never use any of his information, and he'll keep quiet because he's glad to be home. The Monterey Herald, our local paper here, had a story about the governor of Tennessee, and I'm going to compare the coverage for you between the Monterey Herald, the San Jose Mercury, and the San Francisco Chronicle, because I think it illustrates how the news is projected in each individual paper and how important it is for me doing my research to read 10 or 12 papers a day, the ones that I subscribe and then the clippings that are sent to me from friends around the country. In order to get a full picture, or even a fraction, I won't say I get a full picture, but a fraction, you have to take a cross-section of newspapers. The Monterey Herald had an Associated Press story. All of these came from the AP, so that means it was up to the desk to cut out what they wanted. The AP story, December 19th, 1978, has a lead story, Faces State Court Hearing Grand Jury, Parole Selling Scandal, Meshes a Tennessee Governor. This has to do with Nashville, Tennessee Governor Ray Blanton, who didn't run for election this year. Of course, he's been under investigation for several years, and he's going out. He's a Democratic governor, and in January he'll be out. But the grand jury, according to the Monterey Herald story, was investigating a parole-selling scandal that, in quotes, is scarring his final days of administration. Blanton was subpoenaed to appear with undisclosed office files following the arrest of his two top assistants, one by the name of Charles Benson, another Mr. T. Edward Sisk. That's his legal counsel, or was. He's now hired James Neal, a former Watergate special prosecutor, as a legal counsel for Blanton. Of course, what else would it be? You have Leon Jaworski hiding the real Watergate stories of murders and assassinations and possible drug running of the CIA and smuggling of narcotics and weapons, along with these political assassination teams. And then here's James Neal, a special Watergate prosecutor, who's representing Mr. Ray Blanton, and I'm sure that Blanton knows so much that he'll just get a little slap on the wrist. Also charged in the same case, and this is the important name, is Lieutenant Charles Frederick Taylor, 40 years old, who's been 15 years on the Tennessee Highway Patrol. Taylor was suspended without pay and held for a $100,000 bond in Memphis, and the other two are out. The article says the bank accounts of Sisk and Benson and Taylor and others have been investigated by the CIA, and they were by the FBI, not the CIA, I'm sorry, and there were marked bills and money was deposited in their account. It said, Blanton said, in quotes, if his aides are convicted, it would be a great affront to the dignity of all Tennesseans. Now that's the Associated Press story from the Monterey Herald, which doesn't really tell you much except that the governor and his legal counsel and an assistant are involved and a highway patrolman by the name of Frederick Taylor are involved in a scandal there of receiving some money of selling paroles. The next article is from the San Jose Mercury, the lead story saying Tennessee parole probe not over. It goes on to say the evidence so far examined in the parole hearing arrest of 3 aides to Governor Ray Blanton may be, in quotes, only the tip of the iceberg, said the FBI officials. We heard that by Senator Howard Baker when the Watergate investigation was entirely over. The great investigators such as James Neal and Leon Jaworski, they told us as they closed the book, the tip of the iceberg, you only got the tip. The FBI said we have a long way to go. The federal agents have accused the aides of trading paroles, extraditions, and pardons for cash. So the same AP wire service by the San Jose Mercury goes into extraditions and pardons as well as paroles. The 3 men were charged with conspiracy and extortion. It goes on to say how long the governor's office has been investigated. The federal complaint said that Benson had documents for the executive commutation of sentence of a man by the name of Larry Hacker, a convicted burglar. Hacker supposedly engineered the 1977 prison escape of James Earl Ray, convicted assassin of Reverend Martin Luther King. So that article goes a little further, and then we go back to June 20th, 1977 on Dialogue Conspiracy, and I was talking about that phony escape, and this article, a year and a half later, talks about Mr. Hacker engineering the escape of James Earl Ray, and then money going into the desk and offices of the attorney and the governor, and in return they're going to let this man off on a parole. The San Francisco Chronicle has another article on the same subject but written differently, and its lead story is Tennessee Scandal. Parole selling probe is going full steam. And it says the governor of Tennessee accepted the resignation of 2 assistants who've been arrested on the federal charge of extortion, conspiracy, to sell paroles, and for commutations and extraditions. The FBI complaint said that Charles Benson, who was the extradition officer for the governor of Tennessee, had legal papers bearing upon the early release of Larry Ed Hacker, reputed ringleader in the escape in 1977 from Brushy Mountain State Penitentiary with James Earl Ray. I got out my notebook and information that I had done on that phony escape and the radio show that I had done, the work that I had done for that particular episode, because this so-called escape was coming just at a time, as I say, when James Earl Ray would be called as a major witness, and I alluded to very famous possible escapes that seem historically to be accurate. New research coming out about John Wilkes Booth, Amelia Earhart, the actual murder of the Lindbergh baby, Lee Harvey Oswald, the Tsar and Tsarina, and the head of the Russian family and their children, and even Adolf Hitler. For some of you that are buying this tape or ordering it just for the Guyana series, I'm going into this because it precedes the next part of Guyana, and it explains possibly what Guyana was about, in addition to being a school for assassins and a place where mind control and experimentation could be done, and various witnesses could be flown in or out. It raises the possibility, would they have flown James Earl Ray down there? Did they fly him out? The governor at the time said they thought he was in Nicaragua. He gave that as a speculation that he could be in Nicaragua. But was Guyana used for something else during the years before a large group of black people were brought down there for a front? I mentioned, this is June 20th, 1977, about the way that James Earl Ray, in quotes, escaped, and I said there was more to the story than they were telling, and one reason for this scene would be to have an excuse to move him from a state to a federal prison, which would be easier to handle. And I said that they had taken him out of the country but brought him back because there was too much attention paid to it and there would be a major investigation, and that it was a dry run for another escape. They've promised him that he would be able to escape. And I went into the physical tactics of that so-called escape. The wires were cut that night. The voltage was off. The telephones were out of order for 15 minutes. There was the corner of the wall that he was supposed to go off. Nobody guarded it. The closest guard didn't shoot. He was reading a book. He was supposed to shoot if anyone was 10 feet away from the wall, and he was reading a book. There was a diversion area out in the yard where a man pretended he broke his foot. There was a false altercation. He went with 6 other people, and this is the interesting part. The emergency tower was unguarded, and I talked about his work in the laundry room and the man in the laundry room helping him escape, and about the prison intelligence network that allowed him to escape. The warden, or was the warden at the time, that said he might be in Guatemala. And I thought that was interesting because Guyana is very far away from Panama or Guatemala, and People's Temple had members visiting Panama, making bank deposits and so forth. It could have flown him back or taken him, if he had escaped, right down to Guyana. And I mentioned a Edward Hacker who was arrested inside of a rural Baptist church, Edward Hacker. And I wondered if this church was a place for James Earl Ray to escape to and meet, because I mentioned that the people that killed Officer Tippett at the time that John Kennedy was murdered ran into a church and hid down the street in a church, and it was a safe place because nobody suspects a church, and churches make good getaway places. You don't go in with the bloodhounds looking for somebody in church. And I wondered how in the world Edward Hacker got inside the church. And I went into his background and speculated that Hacker had planned the organizing of the escape, that he worked in the plumbers unit. Remember, the White House plumbers, and the plumbing unit is a name for people that fix things. There was a plumber from Lockheed, St. Caesar, that has been accused of being killed. The researchers have said he's the one who killed Robert Kennedy, that Sirhan Sirhan did not do the fatal shot. And there are a lot of plumbers that are involved. The White House plumbers set up, that's a code name for a lot of assassinations and conspiracies. And I did mention that I believe that Mr. Hacker, who was in the church, had a part in the escape of James Earl Ray. That was in June 1977 that I was saying this, and now the complaint in this trial is that they were trying to get executive commutation for that same Larry Hacker that I was talking about, that convicted burglar, that it was indeed Larry Hacker who helped James Earl Ray escape, and that it seems that in return for letting them get out, these high-up officials in Tennessee were given money, and evidently they promised him that if he does this and helps him get out, that they'd be paid off, the officials would be paid off, and he'd be paid off by getting an early parole. Instead of, I don't even think there was a trial. I think they were all put back in their cell, and nothing more was said about that crazy escape. But I think it was a dry run, and I think there were a lot of purposes. I went into the last tape. And Mark Lane, being the attorney for James Earl Ray, and being the attorney for Grace Stevens, and also for the People's Temple, you have one plan where the highest officials of the state not only locked up Grace Stevens in a mental hospital, but they released her to Mark Lane, and they were being paid off to give parole to a man who had gotten out with James Earl Ray, and that included the governor's attorney and the highway patrolman who was involved, and the very person that I named in 77 who assisted in this was being paid off with his early parole. Of course, the old CIA writers were out lauding James Earl Ray's great escape and saying it couldn't possibly be a conspiracy. These pathological liars who get these huge books and legal fees are so disgusting. June 12, 1977, there was an article in the San Francisco Examiner Chronicle, and William Bradford Huey, of course, saying there was no conspiracy. The article says escape or an abduction by conspirators, and Huey was saying, why, there was no conspiracy for Ray. I always told you he was going to escape. He's the only person. There never was a conspiracy. Then George McMillan, the author of The Making of an Assassin, the story of James Earl Ray, says that's damn nonsense to say that Ray had outside help in the escape. He did it alone. I always told you he could do it. And then Percy Foreman, the attorney who had represented James Earl Ray, who told him to plead guilty the first time, rejected suggestions that this escape was part of a widespread conspiracy to help her to destroy him. He said that he just took advantage of plans of 5 other prisoners, and that conspiracies are theories as fiction, and it's all a bunch of lies. He said it's consistent with all the other lies that have been printed about Ray. It makes beautiful writing to say, oh, H.L. Hunt probably came back to life and helped him out. But he said, I won't spend my time analyzing the manure. And Julian Bond of Atlanta said, Ray's escape is terrifying. A madman is on the loose. So there's William Bradford Huey, George McMillan, Percy Foreman, and Julian Bond, and they're all a bunch of liars, because it's perfectly obvious now that the highest echelons of the government of Tennessee were paying off people and being paid for assisting James Earl Ray's escape at that time. The same cast of characters keeps coming through the last 10, 15 years as McMillan and his sister Priscilla Johnson and Percy Foreman and Huey. It's so sickening to see their names in the news, and of course they just repeat their lies. Every time the press interviews them, they have to repeat another lie. And now to the second big article, which is separate but not unrelated, because this again involves a primary witness in the Martin Luther King assassination, such an important witness that she was in the rooming house. This Grace Stevens was in the rooming house when James Earl Ray was supposed to have left the rooming house. He says he checked in, left a gun in the room that he was told to purchase. He had a few toilet articles and a radio that he had taken out of the St. Louis, Missouri prison that would identify him as having been in that room. And he claims that he was in a car that Raoul had given him money to buy, and that he wasn't in the rooming house when Martin Luther King was killed. A gun went off, and there's no identification by the FBI or police to this day that that gun was the fatal gun that killed Martin Luther King. But a man was in the rooming house, in the bathroom. He wrapped up the items that were in James Earl Ray's room, left them at the door. And there was a woman, Grace Stevens, whose husband was supposed to have seen the man leave the building, and the FBI wanted to use him as a witness that it was James Earl Ray, and she had claimed that she saw somebody leave who was much smaller and different in size than James Earl Ray. When he was picked up in London and she saw the picture, she said, oh no, that's not him. But right after the killing of Martin Luther King, several days later, the police came in Memphis, Tennessee, and took Grace Stevens to a mental hospital, and then within a very short period transferred her to another hospital where she stayed for 8 years. She goes by the name Grace Walden, and also the common law husband she had was Stevens, so she's known as Grace Walden and Grace Stevens. And as of April 28th of this year, in 1978, Grace Walden Stevens was still in the Tennessee State Prison Hospital, and I'm going into her story now, but I want to get to that New York Times article, and I think I should read it to you as much as I can on this tape, and maybe copy it and give you a printed sheet with it. I think that would be a good idea. Memorandum found in the files of Jim Jones, apparently written by official of the People's Temple, discussed the possibility of Mark Lane smuggling a witness in the Martin Luther King assassination case into Guyana using a false passport. The memo was discovered among papers dated early this year, apparently written by Terry Buford, saying confidential, and addressed to Jim Jones. In quote, I got a message over here that you want me to tell Mark Lane that he should look into some alternative means of getting Grace Walden to Guyana before the CIA might try to stop her from entering the country. Therefore, Mark should try to get her another passport. Now, just stopping right there, the implications are tremendous, because Terry Buford claims that she only went to Mark Lane 3 weeks before Congressman Leo Ryan went down to Guyana, and Lane claims that he only became counsel and learned of Jim Jones in September, or I guess the end of September. He went down to Guyana. He had a press conference in October, so it must have been in September. But this memo is dated the first of the year, early this year. I called Nicholas Hurd. He didn't call back at the New York Times. I tried to get the data on this memo. It goes on to say Miss Walden, a Memphis resident with a history of mental illness, has been put forth by Mr. Lane as a witness who could prove that James Earl Ray did not shoot Dr. King. Investigations by several organizations, including the House of Representatives, have found her testimony useless. But according to the memo, Mr. Lane persuaded members of the temple that the U.S. authorities wanted to silence Miss Walden. I will relay the message to Mark and see what he says, the memo said. I will do so in person, as I don't feel it is wise to do this over the phone. So the question here, of course, is, did Terry Buford get in touch with Mark Lane early in the year prior to when Grace Stevens was released from the mental hospital? Because if she did, then the collusion of the judge in Memphis, Tennessee, or even the governor, again, the same man that's involved with that escape attempt of James Earl Ray, the highest officials in the state of Memphis, Tennessee, may have been arranging for Grace to be removed from the scene just as they were arranging for James Earl Ray to be removed, because she was a primary witness. And Lane said she was an important witness who could prove that James Earl Ray was not in the rooming house, and yet he didn't insist that she come up and testify before the House Select Committee. Lane also took James Earl Ray and put him on Jack Anderson's show, where he had a polygraph test, and Anderson said James is a liar. That's what his attorney did. His attorney got him publicly to be exposed as a liar before the hearings, and never got James Earl Ray before the House Select Committee. And he never did anything to get Grace Stevens. Even though he keeps blaming the CIA for these conspiracies, he kept Grace Stevens away from that committee. The memo said if he doesn't have those kind of contacts to send her down there, do you think we might offer the tampering of Maxine Swaney's passport? We have her passport here, that's evidently in San Francisco, and it might be something that would be similar to Grace Walden. And also, if it doesn't look like her, maybe we'll swap the picture. The drawback of this would be, of course, if a traitor were to look at the immigration list, we would be caught in a minute. The good point of this would be we wouldn't run the risk of getting caught by a passport on the white market. The memo, signed Terry, has surfaced at a time, according to the New York Times, when more and more questions are being asked about Mark Lane's dealings with the People's Temple and the United States government on behalf of the cult. American officials spoke privately today of a letter from the lawyer, Mark Lane, to the State Department, warning that if it didn't halt the harassment of the cult, they'd have to embarrass the United States. They'd move and embarrass the United States. And then Mr. Lane had sent a letter to Congressman Leo Ryan of that effect, telling him, threatening, don't mess around with Jim Jones. Mr. Lane didn't mention the country by name, but they thought maybe it was the Soviet Union or Cuba, and Lane would be trying to embarrass the United States government. The New York Times goes on to say that Mr. Lane often appeared as the person who was feeding the paranoia into Jim Jones in Jonestown. In a news conference on September the 20th, he said that there were massive conspiracies to destroy the People's Temple and a massive conspiracy to destroy Jim Jones, initiated by the intelligence of the United States. Lane has a lawyer down in Memphis, Tennessee with him, a law associate. I don't know if she's a lawyer, by the name of April Ferguson. And in the New York Times it said Miss Ferguson said that there had been discussion about taking Miss Walden there, but there was no reason she could not have traveled openly. Well, the question is, of course, where is Grace Walden now? Because all of the time of the hearing of the House Select Committee, we never saw a view of her or a picture of her with Mark Lane like we have of Terry Buford. And, of course, the open question is she down there in Memphis, Tennessee, or was she substituted for Maxine Swaney? It would be interesting for the State Department. I've called them to see if they found a Maxine Swaney down in Guyana who was dead, but her passport was in the United States, and she's as good as a dead woman. If you give her passport to somebody else, that means that she never can return home. And because there's still 200 people missing and unidentified out of the 1,200 in Guyana. It would be interesting to know if any one of them was Maxine Swaney, who was killed so that Grace could use her passport, or if Grace Stevens is alive, and also the date, early this year, because Miss Ferguson said they had discussed taking Miss Walden there. But if they discussed it early in the year, then Mark Lane is lying about the dates that he started to meet Terry Buford, and he's lying about the date that he started working for Jim Jones, or that Jones was interested in his case. And why in the world would Jim Jones be wanting to help Mark Lane get this woman, Grace Walden, down to Guyana? He had a saying, anyone who goes down there has no way out. And if she was a primary witness, Lane accused the CIA of trying to hamper her testifying before the committee, but she was a primary witness, and he was trying to get her out of this country and out of planet Earth forever by sending her down there. That wasn't protection, and yet her own attorney was instrumental in these shenanigans. On October the 4th, 1978, no, November the 4th, 1978, Duncan Ragsdale from Memphis, Tennessee, an attorney, was assigned as co-conservator for Grace Stevens. I'll do more about Grace Stevens on the other side of this tape, and some more about Mark Lane and Guyana, the tragedy known as Guyana. This is tape number 368, December 22nd, 1978, side 2, and part 4 on the tragedy known as Guyana. Those of you that listened to the House Select Committee on Assassinations this last November watched the spectacle of Mark Lane with Duncan Ragsdale, their co-guardians of Grace Stevens, and here was this important witness that Lane should have been protecting as an attorney. He checked her out of the Tennessee Mental Hospital after being 8 years there, and took her to California, somewhere in Orange County, and then took her back to Memphis to his home. And before the House Committee hearings, they talked about her mental condition, and it was decided between the various people on the panel and Mr. Duncan Ragsdale and Mark Lane that no purpose would be served in having Grace Walden here at this time. I thought that was interesting. If Lane sincerely believed that she was a primary witness and that she was in good care, that they should at least have seen the woman, just as they should have had James Earl Ray up there again telling about his experiences instead of third or fourth person parties removed from him talking. The judge said that they have to have a counsel for her, and Ragsdale was assigned to this case. He had never met Lane before, and he didn't know Grace, but he was assigned, and Ragsdale and Lane were before the committee prior to Grace Stevens being represented by Mark Lane. A group of doctors came on and talked about her mental condition in the hospital, the 8 years that she was confined. Then Lane made a big scene. He didn't act like an attorney who had waited this many years to represent a person, a primary witness, before the House Select Committee. He made a big scene and screamed to the panel, "You have violated confidential doctor and patient relationship," which they probably did. He said, "You violated ordinary conduct and destroyed Grace Walden," which they certainly tried to do, but he could have brought her in. And he accused them, until this moment I couldn't accurately know how bad you were. He accused them of being corrupt and evil men, which they were. Then he said Grace takes no drugs at this time. She's living a normal life, and this is Gulag Bulva. He was referring to the institution in Tennessee where she was confined, and he said, "You all make me sick." And he got up and stormed out of the room. He left Mr. Ragsdale with the information and medical memos, keep her locked up until James Earl Ray's trial is over. And there was a lot of indication in the records that she was, in fact, a political prisoner. But he didn't bring that out as an attorney. This was the one chance in a lifetime he had a client. He let down James Earl Ray. He let down Grace Stevens. And at the very time that all this was going on, November the 14th, was when Leo Ryan was planning to go down to Guyana. And Mark Lane must have heard about it that afternoon, because he kicked up a storm, and in the middle of the hearings, he was representing a client, Grace Stevens. In the middle of those hearings, he tore out like a bat out of hell and didn't even come back, and Mr. Ragsdale was left with the information. Lane didn't even stay in the room, and you know he must have prepared something. It was on radio across the country, and here was his hearing. And at that time, Leo Ryan said, I'm going down to Guyana, and Lane had corresponded or told him, you can't go without me, and Leo Ryan said, who is Mark Lane to tell me when to go? I'm going anyway. And Leo Ryan arrived in Georgetown November the 15th, early in the morning, and had phoned Charles Gary and Mark Lane, and Mark was in Washington for the House Select Committee November the 14th. So he literally tore himself out and was just, he says, coincidentally sitting on a plane going to Guyana with Charles Gary. And his behavior was really weird because Lane had to get in. The congressman couldn't get to Jonestown, but Lane got through and said, just give me a little time. This is a quotation from a book and newspaper articles. Give us 2 hours to talk in Jonestown to see if they want you to come. And Jackie Spear, Leo Ryan's aide, said, you're stalling, Mark, you're stalling. Let's get the show on the road. Well, considering the correspondence of Terry Buford and Jim Jones about getting Grace Stevens down there, I think it's important that somebody from the wire services interview Grace Stevens and make sure she is alive, living at Mark Lane's house. Can you see Grace Stevens as witness to the Martin Luther King assassination, and Terry Buford from the International Banking Assassination Front team of Jim Jones and Mark Lane in a cozy little house scene in Memphis, Tennessee. Mark has moved down to Tennessee, the place where this corrupt governor works and these various officers that have been fired. And in the book, The Suicide Cult, in the back of the book, it tells the story about Charles Gary and Mark Lane and about their departure from there and how Mark had separate food. It said Lane, the specialist in conspiracies, confided he had known something odd was going all along and kept it from Charles Gary. He also knew about suicide plans, but so did the U.S. agencies, including the State Department, the CIA, and FBI. They were aware of the suicide plans, and Lane also heard that they were going to lace the sandwiches with drugs, so he took along his cough drops, and knew all along that the agencies were also familiar with the suicide plans, which in fact turned out to be true, but was Lane just a representative also of those agencies? So the question is, because the way he tore out of the congressional hearings, because of the speed with which he had to get to Jonestown, because he had to get there first, also because of the unidentified dead, and one of the boats went out, and there's an article this week that they were instructed, leave Saturday and don't come back until Sunday. Is there any chance at all that Grace Stevens is there? We'll know in a few weeks if we get enough news people. You might call the FBI in Memphis, Tennessee, and ask about this. Call Nicholas Herrick at the New York Times. I've called, and I've called various desks at the Washington Post, and you reach a dead end. And it seems to me if they really wanted a story to follow this up, after printing this little tidbit about Lane and Grace Stevens, they would follow it up. But I've reached a dead end from the Washington Post, the New York Times, and the State Department. So maybe you can needle them a little and find out what's behind this. The National Labor Caucus has an article which is interesting and is a continuation of some of the questions I asked last week on tape number 367. I referred to that New York Times article, December the 4th, 78, and talked about the man who allegedly married Debbie Layton, George Philip Blakey. Her name is Debbie Layton Blakey, and you have that tape. Most of you are getting this whole 4-part series. You can look that up in the literature with it. I'm going to read you an article by Jeffrey Steinberg and show you how it relates to the past work that I've done. It opens up a few more doors and windows to think about until we continue next week. This article is dated December the 5th, and it said, information released yesterday in New York Times, that's the article I referred to last week, cross-gridded with reports from Caribbean sources that strongly indicate that Reverend Jim Jones and the People's Temple were involved in illegal channeling of mercenaries into Angola to fight against the Angola government in 1975 and 76. The overall command was a mercenary deployment set up and coordinated by Henry Kissinger and British intelligence, the same forces behind the creation of People's Temple and its eventual establishment in Guyana. You notice that under finances and under countries, I have England, and also I have to add Canada. I didn't put that on the list, but the Canadian banks and the British banks were indeed responsible for the deposits in Georgetown and the Jim Jones purchase, or not the purchase, but the leasing of that land. It says, key evidence for this charge appears in the front page feature of New York Times, December 4th, by Robert Lindsay on the background of the Layton family. The Layton family member, one of them was from the American Friends Service Committee with a deployment into People's Temple. The father, a former cult member, Deborah Layton, we went into that before, whose brother has been indicted for murdering Representative Ryan. He confessed this week that he was behind the whole plan, even though he didn't shoot Ryan. He engineered this whole thing. The father, it says, was a chemical warfare expert, which we went into last week. But it says Deborah Layton was sent to Britain during the late 1960s to study at the British Friends School. She became acquainted with a British national, Philip Blakey. Blakey, a member of the Friends, and Layton returned to the United States. Remember, she said she married him, but it wasn't consummated. Both of them were members of the People's Temple. In 1974, Blakey was sent to Guyana to prepare Jones' operations there. You know, I've been stressing how important it was those years from 1973, December of 73, when the land was obtained, up till 1977. It was used for uses we'll never know until hundreds of old black people were brought down there as a front. The tally's been made now, and they're mostly old black women, a bunch of old black slaves with a white entourage. Back to this article, it says, according to highly reliable sources in the Caribbean, Blakey was in Angola from 1975 to 76, functioning as a mercenary against the Angola government while still a member of the People's Temple. During that same period of time, members of an Eastern group, which a Brooklyn-based black nationalist cult, were involved in gun running and drug running. And they were sending mercenaries into Angola under the auspices of the World Council of Churches and the Ford Foundation's Interfaith Council. The East also established a center in Guyana just miles from the Jonestown settlement. And that turned out this week, in this article yet, that there is indeed a large settlement of people right next to Jonestown. It was supposed to be isolated, but there were operations going on there. You see, according to the way I cross-file, where it talks about gun running and drugs and narcotics, I'll put that under 31 in my categories of drug running. And also, if you notice my list under the conspiratorial links, number 65, I made this list 2 weeks and then updated 3 weeks after the Guyana murders, and had the World Council of Churches, for reasons, into this various interlocking conspiracy. And this article mentions the World Council of Churches. I didn't have the Ford Foundation yet. I might have guessed the Ford Foundation would be in it, but we have to add that to the list here involved. It said that they established centers in Guyana, miles from Jonestown. Blakey, who I mentioned as being a very important person, was not among the Jones cultists who perished in Guyana. He is presently in Barbados, having obtained and captained the People's Temple trawler known as the Albatross III, and went on a Caribbean tour during the mass suicide. The Albatross III is registered in Panama and is believed to be involved in large-scale drug and weapons running. And again, that goes back to Section 68B, which I'm adding the country of Panama, and we put it under weapons and drugs. And it also goes again to tape number 294, November the 6th, 77, that I referred on the other side, that had to do with drugs and weapons running, narcotics and gun running, that involved the assassination teams that killed Martin Luther King and John Kennedy and Robert Kennedy. This Caribbean net and the School for Assassins, of course, there was one in Mexico, and then I believe that one had been moved down to Guyana. But in this article, it talks about large-scale drug and weapons running And it says, Blakey's profile as a mercenary handler and a graduate of the British Society of Friends Network is known as the Fabian Society of British Foreign Nest, subverting the United States through its various affiliations. It mentions the Friends operation being infiltrated. It provides another level of powerful evidence that the entire Jones evidence was pre-programmed and controlled on a fine-tuned basis by professional intelligence channels associated with the London Tavistock Institute. That's the one of mind control, the original mind control plans that worked in conjunction with Alan Dulles of the CIA and Reinhard Gehlen, and it is affiliated in the United States with the MK Ultra project. They concluded the article by saying a rigorous investigation of Blakey's career, and particularly its intersection with that of People's Temple attorney Mark Lane, would provide the requisite information for the resolution of the case. For those of you who are taking the tapes on Guyana are not familiar with the past tapes that I have made and radio broadcasts, I've talked about a man in British intelligence named Hugh Trevor Roper, who wrote a book on how Hitler died that is not necessarily absolute final chapter on Hitler. There is a lot of information that he possibly escaped and went to Argentina and Antarctica. And Hugh Trevor Roper could have pulled the biggest hoax of modern history by writing about Hitler's death in the bunker. His book came out just a month before anybody even actually got into the bunker. And then Mark Lane wrote his book, Rush to Judgment, with Trevor Roper writing the introduction. And Mark Lane has been the biggest obstacle to getting the truth out about the political assassinations and the way they come down. And he's covered the John Kennedy assassination the way that Hugh Trevor Roper covered Hitler's so-called death. And the story of Mark Lane going back to England or the possible connections to Blakey. See, this mystery that the Labor caucus writes about, this Blakey profile, we have to find out because, of course, there's no way of knowing now, but Mark set up the House Select Committee on Assassinations, and then as soon as their offices were set up and they began working, he left Washington, D.C. and moved to California and disassociated himself from them. And G. Robert Blakey became the head counsel for the House Select Committee. And, of course, there's always the ridiculous question I asked last week, and I ask it again. Is there any relationship between that Blakey and the Blakey that came from England and then went to Ukiah with Mr. Layton's daughter, Lisa, and with their German connections, German banking connections, and scientific and military connections and clearances? They went up to Ukiah, and Jim Jones went to Brazil, went up to Ukiah, where they all merged with Mr. Tim Stone, who's a lawyer from Stanford, graduate from Stanford, who set up the foundation work and the work for Jim Jones up in Ukiah. And Blakey had gone on down to Guyana and was one of the first people to set up that property. So we have to find out who he is, and the Labor caucus is right. The interaction of Lane and Blakey will be the answer to a lot of questions that we need to know. The Los Angeles Times has a long article, December the 4th, 1978. Mark Lane got $10,000 fee paid by the People's Temple to launch an attack against anybody who criticized the People's Temple. That was a nice little fee, and Lane's job was to offer a counter-offensive for people that were criticizing this operation down there. He would use the media and be the spokesman in the media, have press conferences to defend Jim Jones. Now, this is important because Lane has always used the media to attack the researchers of the assassinations, and I just wonder how many tens of thousands of dollars, or if he's pulling millions out of the Swiss accounts now, if he's taking a cent of it is a payoff for what he's done for the last 15 years. He's put down people that have done fine work, to Chirac and Lillian Castellano and Sherman Skulnick. I think I've mentioned some of these to you, and his strategy is to use the media to keep repeating his same old bullshit over and over about Dealey Plaza and threatening to sue the government, that they're harassing his witnesses and hurting his witnesses where he's their worst enemy, and using the media and press conferences and college lectures in order to absorb any interest in the Kennedy assassination and divert it away from anybody else who would shed the light. I'm going to quote some sections from this LA Times article because it's really important, and it's so typical of the way Lane not only worked with Jim Jones, but the way he worked with the people who were doing work on the Kennedy assassination. He ran down an article that was going to be printed in the National Enquirer that was unfavorable to Jim Jones, and he showed it to Gene Brown at Los Angeles Airport, and was given $7,500 cash for stopping an article, showing it to them, and stopping this article, which would have exposed the People's Temple. Lane's strategy was, according to this document, it was planned September the 27th, 1978, that Mark Lane was going to have a strategy, a $10,000 fee, to use the media, and he was to use public relations offices and fundraising in Congress and have a counteroffensive against anybody who picked on Jim Jones and the People's Temple. It was to be a national campaign coordinated from a Jonestown embassy in Washington, D.C., and he would establish a 3-story building, which Lane now owns across the street from the Supreme Court, and put down anybody, as I say, who attacks Jim Jones. This campaign was, according to Mark Lane, 2 weeks after Lane first heard of People's Temple. Now, this is in the Los Angeles Times. 2 weeks after he heard of it, he was going to plan a campaign. Now, this is supposed to be September 27th, 1978, that the memo begins the offensive. So that means that he only heard of Jim Jones early in September, which you see by the other memo found down in Jonestown can hardly be true, because it was early in the year that Terry Buford was going to meet Lane personally, because talking on the phone would be too hot. Lane's strategy, according to this memo dated September 27, 1978, was to attack the CIA, the FBI, the IRS, the U.S. Post Office, the Federal Communications, alcohol and tobacco and firearm, that they all were harassing Jim Jones. Now, you see, this is what the New York Times article is talking about December the 8th, that he was feeding the paranoia, if there was any down there, because actually the truth is that Jim Jones had favoritism of the CIA when he was in Brazil. He had the favoritism of the FBI, who never investigated any charges in the interest of the family, and who also allowed all the bodies to rot so we wouldn't know what is going on there. For 4 days, the FBI has been part of this terrible scandal of identifying and covering up since the murders down there. He got special favors from the church in terms of tax breaks in Indiana, and certainly accumulating millions of dollars that were unaccountable for in these various banks. Mark Lane accused the post office of interfering with Jim Jones' rights, and the truth is that Jim Jones himself, the People's Temple, were hampering with the mail and censoring and telling people what to write and keeping letters away from their family. And then he accused alcohol, tobacco, and firearms of interfering with them, and it actually is probably the case that they were more involved in getting weapons there. They were not investigated when it came to the DA's office, Mr. Freitas in San Francisco, that there's guns and many rounds of ammunition and so forth going down there. ATF didn't investigate at all, and he had the favoritism. And he had the favoritism of the Federal Communications in the way the radio messages went through, and instead of bothering him, they were letting him do Morse code and three-way messages and so forth that were actually illegal, and he was getting away with all that. Lane had another method of attack, which is interesting because this is the one he used for, again, the researchers into the Kennedy assassination or the Martin Luther King assassination or Robert Kennedy. He said in the memo, "It is apparent various newspapers and freelance reporters have participated in efforts to destroy Jim," so he suggested that they counteract with lawsuits filed against the agencies, which is one of Lane's great things. He has a press conference all the time. As I said before, I'm going to sue this agency and show millions of dollars of damage have been inflicted against Jim Jones, where actually he's collecting anywhere from $13 million in overseas banks and $3 million cash in gold and diamonds. Now, Lane said that 3 weeks before Congressman Ryan made that trip, about November the 1st, was the first time that Lane learned how serious Jonestown was. That's when Mrs. Buford, Terry Buford, came to see him in New York. And October the 5th, he had a press conference that I talked about on the first tape on Guyana, praising Jim Jones. But after this woman gave him all this information, he had it 3 weeks before Leo Ryan went down there. He didn't tell Leo Ryan what was going on. Lane came out of it alive. Ryan was dead. Charles Gary came down there. They stayed clean. They weren't drugged, and they stayed alive, even though Mark Lane knew 3 weeks in advance that Congressman Ryan was going into something like this, and that this actually was a place where there was inadequate diet, just rice and gravy, and that he had millions of dollars in foreign banks and $3 million in the house at Jonestown, and that they had hit squads and assassination teams, and that there were brutal beatings of persons, and that they were staging mass suicides as early as October 77. He was told all that. Other things Mark Lane knew 3 weeks before these 910, 11, 12, 913 were killed is that there was no way they could escape, that there was certain death, that people could only leave with Jim's permission, and they were not allowed contact with any people out in the outside world, and that this library of Marxist books that he was supposed to have and Christian books were a lot of baloney, that most of the people were illiterate and couldn't even read the books, and that it was just a front for acting as if they were Marxists or interested in those political doctrines. Lane knew that and covered this up and let Leo Ryan walk into this nest. Lane knew that there were problems in Jonestown when he went down there. This is a long article from the Los Angeles Times, but it goes into the intrigue of Lane using the news media and how he was going to use it to protect Jim Jones and attack the critics. This was Lane's method of counteroffensive dated September the 27th that he suggested for Jim Jones, the counteroffensive memo. Contact the left publications. Have them do in-depth articles of the Temple. Use Mother Jones, the socialist newspaper in Chicago. In these times, that's another socialist newspaper, The Guardian. Lane's always used The Guardian, and he used the left. He had Larry Flint fly up the LA Free Press, and that collapsed. Plant articles in the left. In other words, the left looks ridiculous. Lane comes out a millionaire out of this whole thing. He can come out with a lot of money, but tie the whole left up with Jim Jones. And oh boy, when the deaths all come, the suicides, plants in 77, won't the left look ridiculous? A congressman who was speaking out for the oppressed, at least getting involved, Leo Ryan, caring about the prisoners or the families down there, is wiped out. But the technique of Lane is so insidious because he's planted stories all over the country in various alternative or underground newspapers about the serious researchers, or tried to damn us or discredit it or get himself blown up with his various press conferences. When he has a press conference, those are the only people that used to come until the Guyana story broke. Lane suggested this is how you handle the press, the counterintelligence operation. He calls it a counterintelligence operation. Here's a man who has been fighting, supposedly, the various agencies, although I know he's worked with them all along. Lane said, in quotes in that memo, there are two different kinds of feature articles that should be written about the People's Temple. They are to be placed in publications on the left. This is just what the left needed. One should deal, if there is a left anymore, one should deal with a campaign to destroy the People's Temple, together with the work that the People's Temple has done in opposition to the war in Vietnam and in opposition to racism. We just found out this week that Jim Jones was supporting Richard Nixon and various Republicans and members of the Birch Society, funding them and working with them. But Mark Lane says, use this campaign. One, tell the harassment that is coming down on them, and two, tell the work in opposition to racism. He says an entirely separate article could be written in depth of the miracle of Jonestown. Lane suggested that you contact special interest publications, those that deal with the elderly. Let's appeal to the old people, the Native American Indians, the blacks, the people with health care problems. It is important that there be a comprehensive film seen throughout the U.S. and the Caribbean and elsewhere in the world that would sell the Jonestown story. Lane said, I've already made contact with the finest French television documentary filmmaker and urged him to see the whole story of Jonestown. In addition, Lane says we should concentrate upon Geraldo Rivera, for a special report on Jonestown and for ABC television. Remember that Lane is the only researcher at all who gets on Rivera and some of these national television shows. We should meet with Jack Anderson and his aide, who is a friend of mine, Les Whitten, who can run a story predicting that we will be filing action in the near future. Now remember, Jack Anderson is a man who has covered up every assassination that the various persons like myself have been trying to open up on John Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, Martin Luther King, the Watergate story, the Wallace shooting, the Chappaquiddick. And here's the man whose program Mark Lane puts his client, James Earl Ray, prior to the House Select Committee hearings, to have Jack say, James Earl Ray is lying, there's no conspiracy. And Lane is saying, I have contacts. These are my friends, Jack Anderson and Les Whitten. We'll run stories with them. Lane said it is particularly important to create an appropriate and truthful image of People's Temple among the organizations on the left in the United States and among black people in the United States. I've already relayed these facts about the temple to Dick Gregory and Ralph Abernathy and various organizations of the left. You see what Lane does? He jazzes up a place to sell it. He calls it counterintelligence. He sells it as a fantastic thing. He brings in all the liberals and Marxists into this thing so that they can write articles and look totally ridiculous when 900 people get their injections. They said this week that out of the 910 or 11 that there were 700 murders, that there were injection shots in the arms where they couldn't have given it to themselves. So that means that a couple of hundred took this Kool-Aid by mouth and the others were all injected and were actually murdered. And somebody testified who was nearby that they heard the fellows, when it was all over, giving a hip, hip, hooray, and they were laid out in a certain position and taken away from the pavilion and put face down. They could tie in all the politicians. They could watch these people die. They were dying when Lane took off with the 4th with Charles Gary. He knew that they were all going to die. He can reap the money, and then he goes on to the next project. And what in the hell is going to be his next project? It'll be hard for him to outdo this one, but isn't this sickening? September the 27th, he got a memo on how to plan his attack, and then October the 5th, he had a press conference on KGO in San Francisco he was on, telling him about this. I talked about that on the first tape, The Wonders of Jonestown. He had a press conference in Los Angeles and the various newspaper people, and he said this is a socialist country and that it's embarrassing to the United States that such a campaign that's so fine would be an embarrassment to the United States. Part of his strategy was to get in Andrew Young, the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, and call attention to what is happening in terms of medicine and progress down in Guyana. Because our tape goes too fast. I'm sorry, there's no more space, so we'll have to continue next week. This is Mae Brussell and Carmel.